This session is about unions and the community, and when we put the agenda together, I was a bit kind of uncomfortable with that as a heading, but we couldn't really think of anything better. But having reflected on it a little bit now, I think what we will be talking about is building the social movements of the future and the work that unions are doing in particular in fostering that change. And to quote the head of the Harvard Trade Union Program at Elaine Bernard, she says, a crucial but little appreciated role of the labour movement is that it builds democratic communities. That's one of the things that unions do. And I know that there's can be a bit of ambivalence about the role of unions in our party, and even a bit of a preoccupation with the relationship at a structural level. But we do need to remember that unions are, in many respects, the lifeblood of the party in connecting the party both to its working base and through those workers and their families to the broader community. But the rights of people at work is still one of the most contested terrains in public policy. It's where people first experience unequal power relationships. So the work that unions do in organising is really important. Unions have also been at the forefront of just about every successful progressive social movement in this country, although I think the current approach on environmentalism is a little bit disappointing. There's some room for them there. So a strong labour movement in its broadest sense is good for labour, it's good for social democracy, and it's good for progressive politics. We're going to hear from three people today about the work that they're doing, both within the union movement and with the broader community, to help to build those sort of alliances for the future. Amanda Tattersall is our first speaker. Amanda is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Unions New South Wales, and she's head of the Sydney Alliance. It's a broad-based coalition of 28 religious organisations, unions and community groups. Ariadne Vromen is from Sydney University. She's a lecturer in government and international relations, and she's done extensive research on political participation, particularly of young people. And Sally McManus is the Secretary of the Australian Services Union. You might have seen Sally in the news recently because she is I guess, auspicing the equal pay case for community sector workers. So we're going to have about 10 minutes from each speaker, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers. Thank you.
So between 1999 and 2003, there was a great story of transformative civil society power, transformation in the power of civil society based in Sydney. In 1999, the New South Wales Teachers Federation, a union many of you would know, large, democratic, was struggling. It was under attack by the Labor government at the time. It was in the midst of a salaries campaign, which it was struggling to win. The Murdoch press decided to play into the battle. On the front page of the Telegraph, just before the state election that year, was a picture of the president of the union with a dunce's cap on her head, with the caption next to it, "If the cap fits, dumb union leader leads union into stupid strike." It was an incredibly hostile, fragile, desperate political environment. Yet by 2003, both Labor and Liberal parties were endorsing policy reforms that were written by and completely in the interests of that union. And to the point that Bob Carr, at his election campaign launch in March 2003, the key policy that he sought to lift up was a $250 million policy to reduce class sizes for kindergarten to year 2 children. And that was a policy that had been produced by the Vincent Inquiry into Public Education, an inquiry that had been run and coordinated by a coalition of organisations that included the Teachers Federation and other organisations. There was a massive shift in how politics was working in Sydney over that 4-year period, and it was because of the use of coalition campaigns. And it's a great example of what can be achieved when there are strong community coalitions. When I talk about coalitions, I'm referring to when 2 or more organisations based in civil society are working together in common cause to achieve social change. Now, so the whole principle of strong coalitions is to produce a strong civil society that has the power and capacity to act in its own interests. And why would you want to talk about such a thing at a conference that's more focused on the Labor Party and political and progressive reforms? And to me, it's because a renewed civil society is actually what is missing. It's the missing ingredient in politics today, not simply about progressive politics, but in politics today. The problem, from where I see it, is that it's actually, the issue is not that there is simply a hollowed out ALP. But actually what we are experiencing at the moment is a hollowed out democracy. There is a people are choosing not to engage in day-to-day politics because politics is seen as an insider's game that's not directly related to their interests. And the potential role of civil society organising is about changing the way in which politics works. That has both implications for the vibrance of our democracy, but it also has very clear implications, not all of them necessarily easy and comfortable for political parties. So I would argue that strong coalitions are actually an antidote to rebuilding civil society, which is also an antidote to fixing the political malaise that we're in. So what I was going to do is talk very briefly through three strategies that successful coalitions use, and briefly mention how they were used by the Teachers Federation. But what I wanted to focus on is actually how some of these things are being used right now as we speak to organise in Sydney. Because as Joe said, well, I've done a lot of research on coalitions, but, you know, and which is very important. You know, we need perspective on these social change strategies. But for 4 years, I've been working with a large variety of organisations in Sydney to build a coalition called the Sydney Alliance. And the Sydney Alliance is doing two things. It's taking these lessons about successful coalition building, and it's taking the strategies of community organising to put them together to try and actually take responsibility for this big project of rebuilding civil society. So I'm going to talk through how we're putting these strategies into practice as well. So, three lessons. The first one is that successful coalitions employ a less is more approach to coalition building. Now, most people, certainly was my experience when I was building coalitions, both in social movements and in the union movement. When I used to build coalitions, I thought bigger was better. The more names on the page, the more power we had. From my experience in both researching coalitions and practicing coalitions, that's just not the case. Less is more. Strategic alignments of more powerful organisations who are prepared to share power together is consistently and always more powerful than a long list of partners with no more commitment than the idea that they'd share their letterhead or send out a joint press release. That's exactly what the Teachers Federation did. And there were three elements to their less is more approach. They only worked with 3 other organisations, and the parents, teachers and principals. They didn't call out a motley crew from civil society. They organised with 3 different partners because they all had a mutual interest in the issues that they were working on. They were working on public education. They organised organisations that were working in the public education community. Secondly, they organised organisations that had power. They actually didn't open up the space to organisations that didn't have a membership base, that didn't have responsibility and legitimacy in speaking on public education. They organised with organisations that were powerful because they were serious about building power to achieve change in the interests of teachers and parents. And thirdly, they pulled together an unusual alliance. Teachers and school principals, I don't know if anyone knows any teachers, but teachers and school principals have both areas of common interest and areas of disagreement. But the Teachers Federation at this point in time decided to put aside the potential areas of conflict because they knew that bringing together the education community would deliver more power than having that tension, sitting with that tension that could exist between teachers and parents. They brought together an unusual alliance, and that was critical in changing the perception of this coalition when it negotiated with government. So that were the 3 elements of their less is more strategy. The Sydney Alliance, this big broad-based coalition of organisations in Sydney, is following a less is more strategy, but in a slightly different way. We want to change Sydney. We want to change Sydney for the interests of its residents to make the city a city that's responsive to people and not simply to politics or to the market. So therefore we need to build a mass-based people's organisation to make that happen. We've got ambitious political aspirations, so we also have an ambitious set of organisations that we've brought into the network. But we didn't just approach anyone. We did a power analysis. We asked ourselves, who in civil society has power and a shared commitment to improving Sydney for the common good? And then we approached those organisations. But most of those organisations were not the same old motley crew who would turn up at the demonstrations I used to be strongly a part of in the turn of the century, with the peace movement and the refugee movement. We actually went out of our comfort zone, went into Western and Southwestern Sydney and started organising a new set of relationships with new political actors, people who weren't actually that interested in party politics, but they were desperately interested in making the city better for their membership.